Okay, so if you remember last time we saw that God saved the Israelites out of Egypt. He gave them the Ten Commandments, and the Ten Commandments were general principles. And then God gave them specific commandments that were outworkings of the Ten Commandments. And then he gave them the tabernacle. And that's what we're looking at today. The tabernacle. Now the tabernacle is like a house for God, and this is what it looked like if you want to look at this nice book here. This is the Rose Book of Bible Charts, Maps and Timelines. It's got a nice picture of the tabernacle here, and you can see that the tabernacle is a tent. Well, you can see, I can't see because it's hard looking at this upside down, but you should be able to see a tent, and they've cut it open to let you see inside. So it didn't really look like that. Obviously there's a covering over it that they've cut open. And around it we have this kind of tent covering here with all these posts put in. When you read this in the Bible, it can be really hard to follow along when you hear about all these posts and you're thinking, what are these posts? But if you have a picture, like if you've got a study Bible and it's got a picture of a tabernacle, or if you remember this picture here, when you hear about the posts, you'll be like, oh yeah, that's what's going on there with all the posts. So anyway, this is the tabernacle, and it's like a house for God. And it's in the middle of all the tents of the Israelites. So you've got all the tents of the Israelites in the surrounding area. And you've got God in the middle in his tabernacle, or in his tent. So the tabernacle is a way that God can live with his people. That's quite huge when you think that they were living as slaves before in Egypt, in a pagan land. Now God can actually dwell with his people. And in the tabernacle, sacrifices are going to be made. Sacrifices are going to be made. And let's read now what it says in Exodus 29. Verses 43 to 46. Exodus 29:43 says, "There I will meet with the Israelites." This is God talking. "There I will meet with the Israelites, and it will be set apart as holy by my glory. So I will set apart as holy the tent of meeting and the altar. And I will set apart as holy Aaron and his sons, that they may minister as priests to me. I will reside among the Israelites, and I will be their God. And they will know that I am the Lord their God, who brought them out from the land of Egypt, so that I may reside among them. I am the Lord their God." So we see here that the idea of the tabernacle is that God will live with his people, and his people will know him, and they will know this is the God who rescued us from slavery in Egypt. Now, you've got to have a certain way of the tabernacle functioning. If God's going to be living there, and God is very holy, you've got to have a certain way of maintaining the tabernacle, and even a certain way for the people in the tents around the place to know how to live right, because God's living there with them. It'd be like if we had the Queen come round now. Before she came round, we'd be like, let's make sure we do everything proper. We want everything to be right for the Queen. And you'd wonder, how do I address the Queen? What do you call her? Do you call her Your Majesty, Your Highness, or do you call her Ma'am? What's the right thing to say? Well, in an even more important way, the Israelites needed to know, how can they live and how can they act if God is living in their midst? And so what they get given is called the Levitical law. Levitical law. It's called Levitical law because it's to do with the Levites. One of the tribes of Israel was called the tribe of Levi. And the people in the tribe of Levi are called the Levites. And it was their job to work in the tabernacle and their job to take care of the tabernacle. So, with Levitical law, you get all these rules about how to do things in the tabernacle. Now this involves sacrifices for sins. So they're going to be making sacrifices for people's wrongdoing in the tabernacle. They even make preparation for sacrifices for people who've done a sin they haven't even realised they've done a sin. So you get sacrifices for sins, but you also get sacrifices for thanksgiving. Now, sacrifice for thanksgiving is if you want to just thank God for something, then you make a sacrifice out of gratitude of what God's done for you. And so the Levites are the guys working in the tabernacle who are in charge of all this kind of stuff. Now, if the people become unclean in any way, there's a whole bunch of rules in the Pentateuch. That's the first 5 books of the Bible. There's a whole bunch of rules telling people if this happens to you, then you're unclean. Like if you touch a dead body, it's like you're unclean now. You can't still be in the camp where God lives. So now you have to go outside the camp. But they'd have rules for when you could come back inside the camp. So they had these provisions whereby you had to go outside the camp if you were unclean, because you couldn't be with God. You could only be living in the camp where God is living if you were following God's commands. But as we go through the Old Testament, we see that the Israelites just weren't able to follow God's commands. In fact, even at the point where God is giving Moses the law on Mount Sinai, the people already disobey God and they make these 2 golden calves to go and worship. And throughout the Old Testament, you see that these people are just not able to obey God's commands. And you see that God doesn't end up dwelling with them in their midst, in the nation of Israel. And so you're left, like you are so many times throughout the Old Testament, you're left thinking, what is the solution? You're left thinking again, who's the promised seed? The promised seed of Genesis 3:15. Who's the one who's going to come and crush the head of the serpent? And Moses even points to this himself in Deuteronomy 18 verse 15. When he says this, he says, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him." So Moses himself recognizes that someone's going to come along one day who's going to be a bit like Moses. He's going to do things like Moses has done. He's going to do some miraculous things like Moses has done. And he's going to be a fellow Israelite, and they must listen to him. So when you get to this stage in the story, you're still left thinking there's someone else coming, there's something better coming. And obviously you can all guess by now who that someone is. It's Jesus. And that's what we're going to look at next when we see how does this point to Christ. But for now, are there any questions?